The lectionary reading for this, the third Sunday in the season of Lent, takes us to 1 Corinthians 10, which we read together a little bit ago, where Paul warns the church about sin and deception, which can quickly slip into our lives unnoticed. Some of you may have a scale in your bathroom, and if you're disciplined each and every morning, you step on the scale and you check. Boy, I know if I miss it for a few days, it comes as a rude surprise that I have, it's not heading in the right direction. So it is with our lives. It's so easy for little pleasantries to slip in unnoticed, and we just don't pay any attention. Just 2 weeks ago, Brandon Bostian, an Amtrak engineer, was acquitted on the 2015 train derailment in North Philadelphia. The train had been traveling at a speed of 108 miles an hour as it rounded a curve that was rated for 50 miles an hour, and the ensuing derailment caused the death of 8 and the injury of over 100. The investigation found no evidence that the engineer was in any way impaired by drugs or alcohol, no evidence that he was fatigued, no evidence that he was using his cell phone at the time of the accident. In fact, Brandon had a perfect work record. Apparently, he simply became distracted when reports came in over the radio that someone had been throwing stones at a train in that particular area. Investigators concluded he had simply lost what they called situational awareness, and he was going too fast around the curve. The report of rock throwers had him thinking about one problem, and he was oblivious to a much more serious danger that lay just ahead. Well, so it is that the Apostle Paul warns the Corinthian Christians against being smug or overconfident in their faith, or to take their Christian beliefs for granted. After all, as we've heard so many times, pride goes before destruction, and haughtiness and overconfidence goes before a fall. And so to drive the point home, Paul reminds the Corinthians about the experiences of the children of Israel as they made their way through the wilderness. Here was a group of people that had every spiritual advantage. They had every reason to be faithful in their covenant with God, and yet they failed repeatedly. Through God's mighty power, they had been released from slavery in Egypt. When the Egyptian armies tried to recapture them, they escaped through the Reed Sea. By doing so, Paul argues that it was as if, just like the members of the Corinthian church, they had been baptized by God's power. They had as their leader none other than Moses the lawgiver. They got it directly from his lips. God provided for them by sending them manna to eat, and water came out of rocks to quench their thirst. And again, Paul goes off and suggests that eating that special bread from heaven and drinking the water of heaven, it was as if they were also participating in communion, just as the Corinthians did. There were flocks of quail for meat. There was the cloud of God's presence always with them, directing them across the wilderness. But as you know, when Moses was up on Mount Sinai, The people talked Aaron into building a golden calf for them to worship. In the book of Numbers, we read of the people fornicating with Midianites and the Moabites, and they were worshiping their Baal. Another time, the people were remembering the good food and the garden vegetables that they used to enjoy back in Egypt. Leeks and cucumbers, pomegranates and figs, even pistachios. They had lots of good eating back there. But now they were grumbling about their more modest provision. We read that venomous serpents were sent against the people as punishment. And when they came to the borders of the promised land, they were too frightened to continue. So they returned to the wilderness until that entire generation had perished. The people who had personally witnessed the mighty acts of God, who had seen these things with their own eyes, ended up failing miserably when put to the test. And so Paul warns the affluent and sophisticated Corinthians, be careful, because the same thing can happen to you if in your self-confidence and your familiarity with the faith, with your assurance of God's love and your taking for granted God's ongoing forgiveness, you ignore the dangers, you ignore the warning signs. And so Paul gives them 4 warnings, 4 things to watch out for. First of all, he says, don't slide into idolatry. Now, I have to confess, when I hear the word idolatry, I think of some primitive person out there worshiping a block of wood or a stone. It just sounds so primitive, so different from anything we experience in our modern life. I don't even give it a thought. However, Tertullian, the bishop of Carthage, all the way back in the 2nd century, declared that it was idolatry that was the source of all the other sins. So perhaps the fact that it's so easy to ignore and dismiss makes it a dangerous concern that we need to be aware of. I had a friend back in seminary who saved and saved and saved to buy the car of his dreams. It was a Datsun 280Z, which was really a sharp-looking sports car back in those days. He'd put on his sunglasses, he'd put the top down, he'd go cruising around in this sports car. Very, very cool. Except for the fact that the car seemed to require an awful lot of expensive maintenance. In fact, it seemed like it was in the shop more than it was out of the shop, and the repairs were simply costing him a fortune. He finally realized he didn't own the car. He was enslaved to it. So often, the idols we worship are liars. They don't deliver what they promise. What is it that you and I worship with our time and our thoughts, our desire and our energy? What is the testimony of our computer Google search history, or your credit card statement, or your monthly calendar? What is really most important in your life? Back in the year 2000, the Fox network came out with a television show called Who Wants to Marry a Multi-Millionaire? How obscene to think that the sacred union of marriage would be based upon such idolatrous and superficial criteria. The show featured a beauty contest with a contestant from every state, and ultimately a winner was chosen, and they were married on stage, and they flew off to Barbados on their honeymoon and returned announcing they were getting their marriage annulled, and it was just all a disaster and a huge mistake. It turned out that the groom had apparently been embellishing his claims of financial success, and that a previous girlfriend had a restraining order out on him, and TV Guide ranked it as number 25 on its list of the 50 worst TV shows of all time. Just an example of the kind of idolatry that people can allow themselves to get mixed up on. Anything that takes God's rightful place in our lives is idolatry. Paul says, beware, beware, don't let it happen. Keep your eyes peeled for what really feels like it's the most important thing. Number 2, Paul goes on to warn against a licentious lifestyle. Corinth was a double port city. It had a port on the Bay of Corinth to the east and on the Aegean Sea to the west. It had a beautiful canal connecting the two, which saved sailors sailing around a dangerous spit of land. So it was a very, very popular city. It was a city filled with merchants and with seamen and with travelers and with prostitutes. At one time, Corinth boasted that it had 16,000 prostitutes there in the city. Many were connected with the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, where to perform a fertile act was believed to ensure the fertility of your farm and your flocks and your family. Some women even carved into the sole of their sandals the words, "Follow me," which would appear in the dust of the streets behind them as they walked. Corinth was a wildly licentious place where having concubines on the side was considered absolutely normal, as it was common in the ancient Greek culture. Wives were supposed to stay home, take care of the house, tend the children, never be seen outside your family door. It was the concubine that the husband would show off as an ornament at the parties or at the horse race or at the theater. And throughout his letters to the church in Corinth, Paul teaches a sexual ethic that must have sounded strange and peculiar to these people. It was an ethic based upon the covenant relationship of marriage. Marriage provided legal guarantees and expectations and provides a framework for commitment and understanding and family stability, which merely living together can never hope to approach. I came across an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, that advised against young people living together prior to marriage. The conclusions were not based upon some structure of morality, but the conclusions were based upon statistics. In the National Survey of Family Growth, reports of marriage and divorce were received from more than 50,000 women. And it was discovered that women who married between the age of 22 and 30 without having first lived together had some of the lowest rates of divorce. A growing body of research indicates that people living together with someone other than their future spouse before marriage are less likely to be happily married and are more likely to end up divorced. And the author suggested two possible reasons for this. First of all, if your spouse has already had a dozen different partners, Well, they have a lot to compare you to. Well, Jeff always brought me my morning coffee, and Ben was a gourmet chef, and Howard was a wonderful dancer, and Carl loved to go skiing. But Jim used to say the most romantic things. Why can't you be more like they were? That's a lot to go up against. Another aspect of this is when the going gets tough. Rather than doing the hard work of muddling through the process, these people have had a lot of experience breaking up. They know how to cut and run when times get hard. Now, if any of you would like a copy of the article, I'd be glad to scan and email it to you. I also came across some comments from lonely seniors looking for companionship who discovered how easy it was to move in with someone or have them move in with you, and just how difficult it was to get them to move back out again. Well, thirdly, Paul warns people not to try and test God to see how much you can get away with. For many of us, the word home is probably one of the most pleasant words in our vocabulary. It conjures up warm memories of loving relationships. We think of home as a safe shelter from the troubles of the world. We think of Thanksgiving dinner and summer picnics and happy times with the people we love. But there are people who will abuse the relationship of their families, who will wear out their welcomes, even at home. Daryl is a young adult addicted to substances, and he returns home now and then to get his clothes washed, get a hot meal, a warm bed to sleep in. He borrows, and yes, he even steals money from other family members in order to support his habit. He always promises to straighten out, and he means it sincerely. He's going to reform. He's going to get a job. He's going to make something of his life. He's going to make his family proud, and a part of him really means it. But somehow, the money always ends up going for drugs. Finally, the family comes to the conclusion that they're not helping him. Their love is simply being taken advantage of. In fact, all their love is doing is helping him avoid responsibility for his actions and helping him to continue a destructive lifestyle. One day, he returns to find his suitcases have been packed, and he's told to go live somewhere else. We love you, but you can't live here anymore. And there are some people who will test God's love the very same way. Oh, sure, it's great. It's great to know that God will forgive my sins. It's great to know I'm going to go to heaven when I die. It's great to know that God will hear my prayers and always be there to help. But don't try to tell me how I should be, living my life. That's my business, and I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I know God will always love me. I know God will always forgive me. Although 2 Peter chapter 2 would certainly suggest otherwise. Paul warns the Christian community in Corinth against being smug and taking God's love, God's forgiveness for granted. And finally, Paul warns the church against whining and grumbling and complaining. The children of Israel did a lot of complaining in the wilderness, and so Paul warned the church in Corinth not to be like whiny, spoiled children. Of course, there are problems and troubles and situations in life that we must face and go through the difficulty and grow through the difficulty. But simply complaining rather than doing the hard work of being about change is a poor choice. We need to ask God for strength and direction and endurance as we go through the difficulties. You know, we live in a world where every day people make wrecks out of their lives, their marriages, their relationships. People know better. Perhaps sometimes they just forget. Sometimes they don't look at the warning signs. Sometimes they think that perhaps they are smart enough or rich enough or powerful enough that they can get away with something bad. Our decisions all have consequences. Sometimes we also need to be reminded and warned. Maybe sometimes we just need to be encouraged. And so Paul writes in verse 13 of this chapter, "You are tempted in the same way that everyone else is tempted." God can be trusted not to let you be tempted too far. You won't be tempted beyond your ability to resist. It simply won't happen. And God will show you how to make good choices and escape from your temptations. Like the Corinthians, we need to be attentive. We need to be careful. Amen.